Right. So the work I'm going to be presenting today, it's based on a review paper that Craig Morris and I worked on for the special issue for the GSSA that was mentioned yesterday. So we essentially looked at the FOB research that has been conducted in the journal from when it was established in 1966 right up to 2023. So thank you. Okay. How do I move this? Sorry, Susie, how do I move the slides? Okay, thank you. Okay, so in grasslands, we know that it is the grasses that contribute more towards the biomass, but when it comes to species richness or diversity, it is the forbs. And of course, maintaining high plant diversities ensures the functional redundancy. In other words, if there are more species in a system, then they are more likely to overlap in their functioning. So forbs are also important for a variety of other reasons. They also produce food and medicine for animals as well as humans. We've also got some forbs that fixes nitrogen, and they also provide a variety of services for the invertebrates. So when it comes to the below ground processes, forbs also play a key role. Recent studies have shown that they have the ability to sequester carbon and of course, also store other nutrients. And additionally, the variation in their underground growth form also ensures that they maintain ecosystem stability as well as resilience. However, despite all of this important ecological role of forbs, there has been very few studies that have been conducted on forbs. Of course, when we compare them to the grasses, and if they are included, as Tim has mentioned earlier, they'd usually be clumped together into a single category and dumped under the increaser 2 species. And those are, of course, the species that increase with overgrazing. Now, of course, ignoring the individual forb responses has a lot of disadvantages. I've already mentioned something about the importance of biodiversity. So by grouping them together, we are unable to assess all of these biodiversity that they can provide us. And additionally, there's also an underappreciation on the role that they can play in terms of forage. And this becomes important in post-drought conditions, because on the onset of rainfall, before the grasses establishes, it is the forbs that are there. And they provide a critical role in terms of providing forage with high nutrients for the animals. And lastly, of course, failure to assess individual forb species, we also fail to detect the sensitive indicator for species. Okay, now that leads us to the aim of our study. So we wanted to assess to what extent are the FOB studies included in the journal studies or overlooked. And of course, as I've mentioned earlier, we looked at the papers that have been published since 1966 right up through to 2023. And for our exercise, we defined forbs as the non-graminoid flowering herbaceous plants. Okay, so for the specific objectives, so we of course firstly assessed how much FOB research has been conducted over time. We also wanted to determine the reasons behind the inclusion of the FOBs in the various studies. And we also wanted to see how are the FOBs assessed? Are they just mentioned in these publications? Is it a group abundance, or are they individual assessments? And lastly, we also wanted to determine the impacts on these FOB species by the various disturbances and environmental factors. Okay, so for this exercise, we conducted a search using the word FOB in the GSSA journals. Of course, the journal has undergone 3 name changes. And then what we did was we took our results and exported them into a spreadsheet, of course, indicating the year as well as the environment. By environment, we used the mean annual precipitation. We also looked at the different vegetation types under which these studies are conducted, as well as what measurements of the FOBs were done and the impact, as I've mentioned earlier. Okay, so before I get on to the exciting results, the first thing that we wanted to see was how do the FOB research compare to the grasses? So we first conducted a search of the species composition and grass, and that yielded close to 400 articles. We then conducted another search using species composition, grass, as well as FOBs, and that yielded about 162 articles. Now, what does that say? So it says that about 60% of the vegetation composition studies are actually excluding FOB species. And then some other interesting facts, FOBs was mentioned at least once in 259 research articles. It was in the title of 4 papers in the journal, and it was mentioned 36 times in the abstract, and it appeared as a keyword in 6 studies. Okay, so for the trends over time, so we can see from this graph that the FOB research was very limited in the earlier decades, and there was a nice steady increase as we move to the more recent decades. And when we look at the environment in terms of where were these FOB studies conducted, we can see that they were mainly conducted in the mesic and the semi-arid systems, with very few studies being conducted in the arid. And thanks to Tim, we now know why, the reason behind that, because there's only 4 FOB species in the arid systems. Okay. And then when it comes to the vegetation types, again, we can see that the FOB studies are predominantly conducted in grasslands as well as savannas. Now, when we looked at what exactly was actually assessed in these studies, so we've got none to represent, nothing was assessed. It was just a mere mention of the FOB in the study. And then of course, we've got the group abundance and the individual measurements. So again, we can see that a lot of the studies on the FOBs were actually either just mentioned the word FOB or conducted a group abundance over the various decades. However, there was a nice trend that we saw towards the last decade where there was an increase in terms of the FOB studies that actually assess the individual responses of the FOBs. Now, of course, it is challenging, it is labor intense and time consuming to do the individual FOB measurements compared to the group abundance, but the results from that are quite valuable. There was a study that looked at fire. So it was in a fire-dependent system, and they looked at the effects of excluding fire from those systems. And when they looked at the different species, it was the FOB group that actually began to show a decrease in both above ground and below ground. Now, what does that mean? It means we can actually use FOB species as key indicator species for various disturbances. Okay, and then when we looked at the grazing impact, again, we can see that grazing came out to be a prominent disturbance that has been assessed on the FOB studies. But again, as we look at the more recent decades, we can see that there was an increase in terms of the environmental factors that are being assessed on the FOB species. And something else that we picked up when we look at the impacts on the FOBs, it was the importance of including functional composition. Okay? So we noted that with grazing, for example, with high grazing pressure, there was an increase in the prostrate FOB growth form. Those are the FOBs that grow sideways, and a decline in your more erect growth forms. And the possible reason for that, it could be that because your erect growth forms have got most of their meristematic regions above the part of the plants, and the prostrates have got them on the base, similar to the grasses, and hence that what makes them erect FOB species more sensitive to grazing. But of course, we still need a whole lot more studies to assess the response of FOBs to grazing, because there are other factors that are at play apart from just grazing. I mean, things like some environmental factors, effects of fires and so forth. Okay, so when it comes to the role that the FOBs play in the ecosystem services, I'm not going to go into detail with this, because in this special issue, there is another review that looks at the ecosystem services that the FOB species provide. But what I just wanted to highlight on this slide are some of the key ecosystem services that the FOBs actually provide. Okay, and then in terms of the research gaps that we identified during our exercise, so the first one, it had to do with the inconsistent definition or grouping of the FOB species. Okay, so now, although the earliest definition of a forb that we could find dates back to about 100 years ago, where Clements and Weaver distinguished forb species from other herbaceous plants, such as your grasses and your sedges. But we still saw a lot of inconsistencies in terms of how the forbs were grouped or defined. And this was not only in the journal, but it applies across board. Okay, so from the journal, we could see that there were some distinctions from the forbs, from the herbs, herbaceous legumes, and geophytes. And in other studies, under the forb category, they actually included the herbs, sedges, as well as the small shrubs. So what does that mean? It means there is a need to have a more standardized definition of a forb so that it can streamline the research methodology on the forbs and also enable comparison studies on the forbs. Okay, so the next research gap we identified was, of course, with restoration. From the journal, there were very few studies looking at the role of forbs on restoration programs. Most of the studies in restoration in the journal focused on the grass, or rather reseeding with grass species. And of course, given the increasing recognition of the role that the forbs play, as well as the extensive transformation of our grasslands due to plowing, overgrazing, mismanagement of fire, it is important that we actually integrate forbs into the restoration programs. Okay. And then the third one that we identified, it has to do with looking beyond taxonomic diversity. I've already briefly mentioned the importance of including functional responses. Of course, diversity indices can tell us something about our systems, including the beta diversity in terms of species turnover, but without a functional composition, the interpretation of our results as well as the application is limited. And of course, additionally, by looking at functional composition, we are also able to compare responses of forbs across the different systems because you will not able to find the same species under different systems. Okay, then that's just to summarize what I've presented. So of course, we've looked at there was a significant shift in terms of the forb studies, with the earlier studies focusing more on the role of forbs for forage, and later studies recognizing the role that forbs can play for biodiversity. And then, of course, as I've also explained earlier as well, it is quite important to have a more standardized definition of the forbs, the importance of integrating forbs into restoration programs, and also looking beyond taxonomic species diversity. And overall, I think what we'd like to say is that, of course, not all forbs are weeds, but the opposite is also equally important. Not all forbs are good. So hence the need to actually assess these individual forb responses, because although it is challenging, but it does provide us with some valuable knowledge. And I'd like to acknowledge the following people. And that's the reference of the review paper and some of the key references. And before I end, just keeping in line with the movies that Tim briefly mentioned. So Craig sent me this movie with the catchy title and slogan, The Forb Factor, a botanical trail of biodiversity, buried truths, scientific redemption. I got so excited. I went to Netflix to look for this movie and I couldn't find it, only to discover it was his AI creation. Thank you.
You mentioned there's a lack of research on restoration of forbs. Did you get any feel in the review for what might have been lost? Because, you know, often if you looked at overgrazed lands, you see a lot of the grass species are still there, but you don't really have a sense of what might have been lost regarding the forbs.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. But I think my understanding, it's not so much in terms of research, because there was one key paper that gave an indication in terms of how the forbs can be included. I think the issue comes with actually integrating them into these programs. And I think an example of some forb species are the geophytes. We know that in the primary grasslands, the geophytes tend to dominate, but once the area has been transformed, such as the old grasslands, then all of those geophytes, they don't come back. And I think it has to do with some of the growth forms that don't persist after the areas have been transformed. But I'm not sure I quite answered your question.
Next up is Richard Fynn from the Okavango Research Center at the University of Botswana. And just, this has been, you'll get 12 minutes, then time is up. If you go beyond it, you'll use your question time, but your 15 minutes are up and then wrestle you off the stage.
Great, thanks very much. Great to be here again. My old stomping ground from high school and university. This presentation, what I want to do is highlight some key issues that are being used to determine how to manage cattle in particular grazing systems, which is leading to some management effects that, or management decisions that are not really based on good scientific fact. Okay, there's widespread perception that grazing of the regrowth of grasses is bad for the persistence of those palatable perennial grasses. So many grazing systems today, they try to avoid that. Okay, the short duration grazing strategy developed by Alan Savory is a classic example of this, where it's considered bad to allow the cattle to regraze the grasses after grazing, so you must move them as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's why they have these very short grazing periods, to move the cattle before there can be new regrowth. Okay. It sounds logical and reasonable, but is this really useful or helpful? Let's have a look at that. Okay, so this is, Kevin will recognize this graph because it is from his PhD, very nice study. But essentially what happened here, what they did here was at Ermelo, they had an area that they grazed in the previous year. So you're seeing the results here is the next year's, the productivity from the next year. And what you're seeing is the previous year's effect. So they had cages to protect from grazing. That's the open bars. And what you can see is that if you protected an area from grazing the previous year, your palatable grasses, Kevin, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but your palatable grasses decreased greatly in productivity. They were more productive if they were protected the year before. Okay, which has got to do with their root systems. If you graze them heavily the year before, their root systems are decreased. So the next year, they're not going to produce. But the interesting thing is, the counterintuitive result is that your unpalatable Aristata erecta did the opposite. It showed that if you grazed it the previous year, it increased in productivity. So how can it be? How can that happen? Well, it's got to do with selective grazing, because while they had access to grazing, they didn't really graze the Aristata erecta. Okay, this is an example from the Kalahari, your highly palatable Brachyera nigropodata, one of the key grasses there. You can see how they've grazed that, but they haven't grazed the Starpogrostis uniplumis. They haven't grazed Ergostis rigidio. They will graze them if they have to, but they much prefer to walk around eating Brachyera nigropodata, and that has some serious negative consequences for the Brachyera. The main thing is that if you get regularly grazed, excuse me, over the season, you hammer the root biomass. Okay, so the roots decrease over time, over the season for grazing. Whereas if you left, like your Aristata, you get nice big roots. So what happens is competition for the Aristata greatly decreases in the next year, because the Thumida hasn't got any roots to compete with. And what I'll show you is that's all mainly about roots in competition in grasslands. Okay, very little shading effects. This is Michelle Tedder's master's work, which is a very nice study. She used PVC tubes that she put in the ground, and then she planted a phytometer in the middle, which you measure the biomass, the growth of the biomass. So these PVC tubes either allowed roots in through they had holes in them, or the holes were covered with Nitex that stopped the roots from growing in, okay? So in the first one, where that treatment where you stop the roots growing in, you can see that the phytometer greatly increases in productivity because it's getting no root competition from the neighbors, okay? Similarly, in that treatment, you're cutting the neighbors around the phytometer, you're cutting them. Like we saw, when you cut it regularly, it reduces the root biomass. So essentially what you're seeing here is one and the same effect. Both are reducing root competition, okay? And both result in the same effect. Your central species increases in productivity. That's why the Aristida erecta increased in productivity. Its competition was completely removed, basically. So if, however, you see, if you can get the cattle to graze non-selectively, okay, the situation changes completely, okay? And we can get the cattle to graze non-selectively. Okay, so this is a study that I did looking at competition between Thubela and various grasses, and we grew them in plots, not pots, at the Arboretum at main campus here at UKZN. And you had cutting treatments, that's the solid bars, and no cut treatments on the plots, okay? And then that's measuring the proportion of the species in the plot, okay, at the end of the experiment. And this is a soil fertility gradient, okay? And what you can see is when you have cutting of Thubela, it completely eliminated Erigostis curvula, just in, I think it was 1 year of treatment, so if I remember correctly. So it completely eliminated Erigostis curvula, but not when the Thubela was not cut, okay? And the same with Aristida jansiformis, it pretty much eliminated. You can see it's got almost 100% of it, it takes up almost 100% of the plot under cutting, okay? And what this shows you is Thubela is very competitive under cutting, okay? And this is pretty much the case with many of the palatable grasses. That's their strategy. They're very competitive under non-selective grazing, okay? And you can see this at Eucalinga. This is the Eucalinga long-term burning mowing experiment. And what you can see is with no mowing, in the first column is no mowing. Thubela was much less abundant. There's various burning treatments in there, but that's, we're looking at the mowing here. The early summer mow, Thubela was really abundant. Late summer mow, not as much. I preferred an early summer mow, but an early and late summer mow, it was really abundant. So it became very competitive under mowing, okay? Non-selective, okay? Same with Heteropogon and other short grass, similar response. But look at your Aristida, hated mowing, especially a double summer mow, a Hyperina hirta, same, Erigostis curvula, same, even the big tall Symbopogon species, none of them did well under mowing, okay, non-selective grazing. So what this shows you is that if you can implement non-selective grazing, like Clive Bunting did at Strathern Ranch, here this grazing management system is, to me, the optimal approach for managing sow filth. So what they do is that the cattle don't just graze everywhere on the farm. They graze, you have your priority, this is called a priority paddock, okay? The priority paddock, you focus the cattle, you first burn it in spring to get everything short and even playing field. Then you focus the cattle grazing in on that paddock and you keep it short the whole growing season. The whole growing season, it's kept short like that. Notice the non-selective grazing and notice the high forage quality. So it results in vastly different impacts, not only on species composition, but greatly improved animal performance because they have access to that sort of grass, okay? You move the cattle to non-priority paddocks only if rainfall's bad and you don't have good regrowth in this paddock, okay? So what happened was Thubela, just in 8 years, increased from 8.7 to 21.5%, and your taller Hyperina hirta went down dramatically, okay? And then that photo I took about another 10 years later, okay? Well, actually, no, about 6 years later. And it had continued, the increase was amazing, unbelievable, just dense grazing lawns of Thubela triandra on this farm. This was an amazing farm, and tragically, Clive sold the farm, his son didn't want to take over. This would have been a gold mine for science, this farm, if we could have kept it. Your management, the implications that I want to bring out here is the implications for management is that you must achieve non-selective grazing, okay? And so where do we fear the second bite? We only fear the second bite if you have selective grazing. That's where problems come, but not under non-selective grazing, okay? Now for the brave at heart, that's meaning farmers who are prepared to really put in some serious management effort, include high density grazing within what I call the split ranch framework, similar to what Clive is doing. And I'll show you what I mean here. I call it facilitative recursive grazing, okay, and I'll show you why. And I really believe it's the ultimate way to manage cattle, especially in, well, actually in many of the Kalahari grasslands as well as the Southveld. So look at the Serengeti wildebeest, okay? They come into an area, they graze it down, and this is photos taken by Michael Anderson, and you can see the regrowth. That's not fire, that's regrowth after grazing, okay? McNaughton showed before grazing, it was 10.8% protein in the grass. The regrowth has 15.7% protein, okay? Incredibly high protein. And so the wildebeest, they come back to utilize that. He says, McNaughton noted that after about 2 or 3 weeks later, the wildebeest come back. That's where the recursive, I call it facilitative, of course, in herbivore ecology, that's a key thing, facilitating high quality grazing through grazing, through high quality forage through grazing. And then the wildebeest have this recursive strategy, coming back to utilize that high quality grazing. Now, this is where holistic management gets it wrong totally, because holistic management loves to claim that they are facilitating these big herds of herbivores, but they do the opposite. They continually move their animals into that low quality tall grass, never allowing the animals to come back to the high quality regrowth, because they say it's bad for the grasses. But as I've shown you, under non-selective grazing, it actually advantages the good grasses. So they've got it wrong completely here. And they give them the worst quality forage and terrible animal performance as a result. That is why holistic management has failed in KwaZulu-Natal, because of the Southveld. They've never understood this concept, and it is never taken on in KwaZulu-Natal because of that. And so let's see how we can do it, okay, using high density grazing. So these are the type of ranches we're using up in Botswana, what we call split ranch. Quite a lot of the farmers taking, you graze half and you rest half for an entire season. I haven't got time to tell you here why you need to rest for an entire season, but it is very important. So you can, what we start off with was the priority. We're adopting Clive Bunting's approach here. That was actually initially developed by Fynn and Rivers at Sadara and then modified by Tehran. They had great insight. The priority is the one you're going to burn and keep it short the whole season for the high forage quality. So then you can subdivide it into smaller paddocks for high density grazing, just to get more non-selective grazing going. And what you move the cattle from 1 to 2 to 3, 4 to 5. Now, this is where the holistic guys go wrong. Okay, instead of moving back to 1, they now continue to 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, always moving into the old growth instead of coming back to 1. Because after a few weeks, what do you want to do? You come back to 1 to use the new growth, and then you go to you would go to 2. But if you had bad rainfall and there's no regrowth, then you can go to 6 and 7. But all the time watching number 1 and 2 and 3. Waiting for the rain, waiting for the regrowth. You go to 8, 9, 10. Even if you have to go to the sea, you go to there. But now the rain has come, then you come back to 1, okay? Because now the regrowth is there. So you're always working off your priority paddock. You may never, ever have to use C. C might, in a good rainfall year, you never use it. So it gets an extra year's rest, two full years of rest, which is really important. So this system is building in flexibility. It's bringing this high forage quality. It's bringing in the non-selective grazing, and it's building in extra rest to the system. So I really believe this is the way forward. And we really need to start pushing this to get farmers to understand these concepts. Because until they keep going to these holistic management conferences, they keep getting told this rubbish that they believe. And because they don't have the science to deal with that, they accept it and they try to take on these sort of systems. So we need to change this. And it's up to this to society to do something about it. As Tutuku told us yesterday, if we don't put science into action, we're wasting our time. So it's time to put science into action in these things. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. However, I'm just a little bit concerned. Theoretically, they say continuous grazing, it results to reduction of root growth because of the plants tend to focus on the above ground production. In the case of climate change, where moisture content deplete in the soil owing to the rising of temperature, would that not going to affect the plant in the long run?
Well, you see it's not continuous grazing. You see you give it a full year's rest after. Yeah. So sorry, yeah. The year after your grazing, you have a year of continuous grazing on that priority paddock. The next year is a full year's rest to allow that those plants to put down those deep root systems. So you actually you are stimulating good deep root systems on these grasses, and also by increasing the over time the good perennial grasses which have the deeper root systems. This is what we've seen in Botswana. Is even in a drought year, they still produce grass because they've got these deep root systems. You've rested them for a whole year, allowed them to put down these deep roots. So come the drought year, they still produce grass. Yeah. So yeah, I believe it's very good under climate change, this approach. Yeah. Urs. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Need to stay on our Plan B schedule at least. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Mthunzi Mndela from University of Fort Hare. We're very pleased to have him back in the Eastern Cape after a long foray in Pretoria. And he will talk to us about understory, overstory dynamics and the bush encroachment. Over to you.
Sorry.
Next.
Okay. Okay. Morning. I greet the house at large. My name is Mthunzi. My surname is Mndela. I am delivering a talk on heterospecific woody plant overstory, exacerbates woody plant encroachment in semi-arid savanna of South Africa. Here I'm presenting a study on the relationships between the overstory and understory relationships. So in this study, we define heterospecific woody plant encroachment as an encroachment caused by various species. And also we have a term conspecific encroachment or conspecific overstory encroachment as the encroachment of single species. In this case, Acacia carew. Bush encroachment has been reported across the globe, and it causes serious declines in ecosystem services and also functioning of a savanna biome. Amongst those ecosystem services is a decline in biodiversity due to increase in woody plant density and cover. Another one is an increase, or is a decline in biomass production, which obviously serve as forage for animals. There are other ecosystem services affected by bush encroachment, including hydrology, that is loss of water due to increase in canopy and also increase in density of woody plants. The drivers of this problem have been identified, have been talked about for a very long time, but however, solutions are not there. We've been talking about how bush encroachment is increasing across the globe in various continents, particularly or largely in Southern Africa. But however, there is no solution. Now the question is, are we missing something? Is it because of the fact that we cannot control some factors that are driving this problem, such as climate change, increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide, because we're able to manipulate fire frequencies and overgrazing? I believe and hypothesize that we are missing something. And that thing is the fact that bush encroachment is also caused by overstory woody plants. Therefore, because we overlook this And I believe that understanding those dynamics and the processes leading to increase in understory seedling recruitment of woody plants also limits us in terms of deriving appropriate management in terms of controlling the problem. Here I show two pictures. The picture at the top there indicates the extent of bush encroachment, particularly at a local scale. In our municipality, that is Raymond Mhlaba. The map at the bottom here indicates the extent of encroachment. This problem is serious at a local scale. You can see that woody encroachment has expanded even beyond 60% of the whole municipality. As you can see the red color in the map at the bottom there. We are only left with very few grasslands in the municipality, which is a serious problem. As I indicated, that we hypothesize that also the overstory woody plant encroachment might be facilitating seedling recruitment. This is due to the fact that overstory plants change microclimate, the hydrology underneath canopies, and also soil fertility. These together obviously allow more seedlings of various species to encroach, causing what is called thicketization. The effects of bush encroachment in this context can vary between different structures of these overstory woody plants. That is heterospecific and conspecific. Janssen 1971 indicated that in his model of negative density dependence, that there is under conspecific encroachment, that means where there is one woody species increasing in density, there is also a tendency of more pathogens being attracted in that type of the ecosystem due to the fact that it's easy to identify these hosts as the specific species that increase bush, that are being targeted by certain pathogens. But however, in heterospecific encroachment, it has been found that there is increase in density due to the fact that overstory of woody plants, which are different or diverse, allow those seedlings to encroach in large numbers because of variation in resources underneath canopies of these trees. We therefore hypothesize that heterospecific encroachment drives understory recruitment of seedlings, which therefore leads to thicketization in our semi-arid savanna. So we are asking these questions, and we conducted this study with the objective to try to answer these two questions. The first question is there any variation in seedling recruitment between conspecific and heterospecific encroachment or overstory structures? Does the type of overstory encroachment affect the seedling and sapling species richness? So we conducted this study in two areas. That is Tukulu Farm, which is a communal rangeland, which has a history of being owned by a man called Matthews, if I call him correctly. It was previously a commercial farm, but now it's under the ownership of communal people. And obviously there were changes in terms of management, including communal grazing, which is including now continuous grazing. It's no longer rotational grazing. And also we compared that to a privately owned farm, which is University of Fort Hare, where they apply rotational grazing. So these two rangelands are 1 kilometer apart, but they fall within the same climate, same soil type, but the management differs. The vegetation type of the area is Bishoptonveld of the Eastern Cape. So we identified these two types of encroachment, that is monospecific, which we also refer to it as conspecific, which is an encroachment of a pure stand of Acacia carew. and heterospecific encroachment, which we refer to it in simpler form or in simpler term as multi-species encroachment, where various species encroach and form some sort of thickets. And obviously they form clumps, which now at a larger scale, they now cover large areas, now causing problems in terms of reducing forage production for grazers. So this is where we conducted the study in terms of the map in the Eastern Cape, Raymond Mhlaba municipality. So we selected randomly 4 areas which are 1 hectare blocks in each of the areas where we were doing study, that is at University of Water and Tukulu Farm. So in those 100 by 100 meter square areas, we used high resolution aerial maps to identify those conspecific and heterospecific encroachment. So we then categorize the encroachment in terms of different classes of encroachment, that is the areas which are not encroached, where the cover of trees is less than 20%. And then we also had another class where the encroachment of trees is 20 to 50. We referred to that as a moderate encroachment, and higher encroachment above 50%. So we have 3 classes by these 2 areas. That is, we refer here loosely as land tenure systems. So we refer to the ownership as land tenure system in this case. So in each of these blocks, we marked 6 plots, which are 10 by 10 meter plots. That means 6 plots by 2 overstory structure, heterospecific and conspecific, by 3 levels of encroachment by these 2 sites, that is privately owned and Tukulu Farm. Okay. So this is just a picture of how canopy cover was in these different treatments, that is under conspecific and also heterospecific. These are the pictures indicating the stands of encroachment, that is monospecific by Acacia caru and heterospecific by different species, including Scutia metina, Ziziphus mucronata, and others. So in this study, the analysis that we conducted is an analysis of covariance, where we included the density of the encroachers as the covariate in this case. So we conducted the analysis in terms of understanding the fixed effects of land tenure, overstory structure, and also encroachment level. We confirmed our significant differences at 95% confidence interval. So we also generated different models to try to predict how does overstory affects seedling encroachment in terms of which factors are great predictors of seedling recruitment. So in our selection of these models, we considered IC, root mean square error, and R square. We also used the variance inflation factor in terms of starting the collinearity between different factors. So these are our results. We found out that in conspecific encroachment, there was relatively low seedling density, as indicated by a gray color there. Even at high encroachment, it was significantly different compared to high encroachment of heterospecific encroachment. That also happened at moderate level of encroachment. Now, if we look at now sapling densities, we found out now that the difference tended to decline between these 2. That is conspecific versus heterospecific, both in high encroachment and moderate encroachment. We now looked at how does these different species, encroachment levels and encroachment types, which is overstory structures, affect species richness of seedlings. We found that there is a huge significant difference between the encroachment of conspecific versus heterospecific. At high encroachment level, that there were more species at heterospecific. Obviously, this is due to the fact that many species are encroaching, and also conditions are conducive under canopies of these different species due to variation in resources underneath canopies. Now, when we look at sapling species richness, also we found significant differences, particularly at high and moderate encroachment. We then conducted relationships between seedling density and the species and different parameters that seek to describe the overstory. we found out that there is a decline in seedling density as the density of overstory woody plants increases. However, seedling density is increased with canopy cover, increased with also woody plant height, the species richness of the overstory, and also the basal area. So this took us to designing these models. Obviously, we conducted a stepwise removal of certain parameters due to lack of significance and also due to presence of collinearity between two variables or predictors. We found out that in our first model, which includes different variables, predictors, that is, we find that there is our model was relatively strong with those different predictors explaining about 74% of variation in seedling densities. But however, we decided to remove plant density of the overstory structure, mainly because there was a high collinearity between overstory densities and also the canopy. And the model didn't change that much because it only declined by 1 unit to 73% variation. Here are the pictures indicating the recruitment of seedlings underneath the heterospecific. Here, I'm not sure if you can see those seedlings underneath these canopies of these trees. There were more seedlings under heterospecific encroachment. And where there is no encroachment, you can see there are some seedlings that are also germinating within the spaces between swards. But however, where there is acacia only, there were relatively few seedlings underneath canopies. You would find seedlings on interspaces between trees. Therefore, we conclude that overstory encroachment drives under canopy seedling recruitment. And also seedling proliferation was also associated with high canopy cover and species richness of the overstory. What does that mean? It means that now we can design a management, but obviously this requires us to first understand which species are promoting seedling recruitment so that we can now apply selective canopy thinning and also removal of certain species that are not of significant importance for maybe livestock production and other important ecosystem services. Thank you very much.
I'm afraid we're out of time for questions.
Yes.
So I would like to thank you again for your talk, and please welcome Urs onto the stage. Recently retired from Texas A&M University, happily retired in the low veld. We're also happy to have you back. Yeah, I'm going to try and move this a little bit.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Yes, it's wonderful to be back in South Africa, more or less permanently. I am actually resident in 2 countries, and I will flip back and forth, trying to be more in a democratic country than the other one. Somebody asked me if I'm happy to be back in a democratic country, and I've got to say, yes, I am. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you very much to Tim O'Connor for saying that it's important to publish in local journals. Even those of you who are elevated scientists and prefer those international journals, a journal cannot grow in stature if we don't have names that are well recognized and that people look out for. So please do take Tim's comments to heart. I also want to say something, that broken bridge that he referred to, I was involved in the construction of that bridge in the mid-70s. My father's company, KB Construction, built that bridge, and I was involved in that construction. And no, it's not because it was poor quality construction that it blew out. That flood was truly epic. There was no bridge that could have withstood that pressure. And so when I saw how that bridge blew out, it was truly shocking, and what Tim pointed out was really remarkable. Also want to make a quick comment about something that Richard said about HRM. And I'm disappointed he didn't use the more contemporary term of adaptive multi-paddock grazing. This leads directly to my talk, because the old adage of rotating animals through a fixed number of paddocks, certainly among those who propose more intensified grazing management, I think has gone out the window quite a long time ago. Certainly in the United States, the idea of having to rotate through all of the paddocks before you come to the first one is not something that's really being promoted. And that's where the term adaptive multi-paddock came into being. And I was, I believe, the first one to coin that term because I had a conversation with somebody and he was wanting to call it regenerative grazing. And I said, look, we really need to say what we're actually doing here, and that's using multiple paddocks to be able to manage adaptively. And so for those of you who don't know, that's where the term originated. And I've made a lot of inquiries and I can't find any other source for it. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about is measuring what we mean by adaptive decision-making in livestock production. This is work that was conducted by one of my last PhD students, Jenna Likens, who's graduated. She's now moved on. And she did some really outstanding work, both on a grazing management intensity index, which we're in the process of trying to get published. And it's contentious and people don't like new ideas sometimes. They challenge, entrenched ideas. But also importantly, when we talk about adaptive multi-paddock grazing, what do we mean by being adaptive in livestock grazing systems? So first of all, what is it? Well, adaptive management is a structured iterative process of adjusting management actions based on evaluating responses to prior management actions or to changing conditions, I think I must add. And the purpose is to improve decision-making over time based on improved understanding of the inherent uncertainties in the complex systems that we're trying to manage. So how's it been defined in the past? Often we talk about threshold number of paddocks. You could have 6 paddocks, 8 paddocks, 16 paddocks, 32, 130, whatever. I mean, people say that's the threshold number that you need for a particular area. And then often those recipes get applied without considering the local context. They're also being talked about, flexibility in management. But the problem is that these inconsistent approaches to the idea of adaptive management have really led to an inadequate or a low level of application of comprehensive adaptive management programs. So Jenna's work was intended to say, well, what is it and how can we quantify it? So when we think about that, we really also have to think about systems thinking, which is in managed grazing systems, which are complex and dynamic systems. System thinking is characterized by non-linear relationships between system elements, by feedback loops, and importantly also by response lags. Sometimes we think we do one thing and immediately the system responds. Well, there's a lot of buffering in natural systems. So those response lags can be quite significant. But the feedback loops are really what we need to focus on. So natural resource managers always operate in an environment of uncertainty, lots of exogenous uncertainty, but also uncertainty about when we do one thing, what actually happens. So system thinking has therefore been promoted as a strategy to enhance the decision-making in complex natural resource systems through double loop learning, in which cognitive representations of the real world or mental models that we all use on a daily basis are revised based on real world feedback. And it's suggested that adaptive management processes promotes this idea of double loop learning, and we'll talk more about that. All right, so the framework that Jenna adopted was largely based on the 5 elements of adaptive learning, which include planning. You plan whatever the management practice you're going to implement, the grazing system you're going to implement. You implement it. Plans without implementation are just collect dust on a shelf. Then you've got to monitor what happens, and then you've got to evaluate to see whether the actions that you have taken are actually leading you towards the outcome that you're interested in. And then you adjust your management actions accordingly. If you're going in the wrong direction, you might have to change direction entirely. If you may have to tweak it. It just depends on what the particular response is, the feedback loop. However, the framework for selecting, monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting management actions in grazing systems is generally lacking. And so Jenna's work was intended to try and fill this knowledge gap. Also, in terms of mental models, many people use this notion. We actually use mental models on a daily basis. For example, you couldn't drive your car if you didn't have mental models of the world. What are mental models? Those are perceptions of reality that we have developed over time based on belief, based on experience, And then, based on other factors, sometimes social factors, that make us see the world in a particular way. When you're driving a car, you're evaluating what's happening in a particular way. And those mental models adjust over time. So I used to tell my students driving, when I was young, I felt my response time was just instantaneous, right? And you see a lot of young people driving on the back of other people's cars, not only young people. But as I got older, I realized my response time isn't so good anymore. And so I tend to have more of a distance. That's the shift in mental model about what safe driving distance is. So mental models are critical because we cannot actually operate without having these shorthand cues for making decisions. So the goal, objective, and hypothesis that Jenna's work was based on was to develop an instrument to quantify adaptive management implementation, to evaluate the relationship between level of adaptive management and level of systems thinking skills in the grazing system. Those were the two main goals. And the objectives were to develop a viable and validate indicators of each phase of adaptive management, those 5 phases that we listed, to construct a composite index of adaptive management based on these 5 different elements, and then to assess producer perceptions of grazing system dynamics, and then to look at the relationship between their level of adaptive management implementation and their perspective of grazing system dynamics. Hypotheses are kind of complex, so I'm going to read it just so that I don't trip over it. So if the constructive adaptive management index comprehensively captures the structured decision-making processes described by theoretical adaptive management frameworks, then an increase in the adaptive management index would be associated with perceptions of increased level of connectedness between critical elements that contribute to the dynamics of grazing systems. It's important to say perceptions because we don't actually go and measure. We ask people what they think, and that's a perception. And so we don't want to overreach in saying, well, that's what they're actually doing. So the methods to develop the composite indicators and scale development. First of all, she conducted a comprehensive literature review to develop conceptual definition of adaptive management and identify various indicators. She then identified 10 experts in grazing management and asked those individuals to indicate the extent to which they felt that these different indicators represented grazing management systems. And then also conducted modified kappa analysis, or obtained modified kappa statistics, in which generally a value of greater than 6 is considered to indicate that an indicator is representative of what you're trying to describe. We then surveyed, or she surveyed 2,100 producers in Texas with greater than 100 hectares. Of course, a bit of a problem for us, but that's what it was. We've got a 25% raw response rate, and we're able to use half of those data, which had half of those responses, which had sufficient data for the analyses. And then she conducted a principal components analysis to examine the proportion of variance explained by the different elements of adaptive management indicators, and then conducted a hierarchical aggregation of those indicators into the adaptive management index. In terms of perceptions of grazing dynamics, grazing management literature was again searched, and theory was used to, and as well as theory used to identify 5 elements that affect grazing system dynamics. These were herbaceous biomass production, number of animals on the land, attention to grazing management, ecosystem function, and profitability. So the survey participants were asked about their perceptions of these different elements. Yes, ma'am. What? Wow, okay. All right, then again, the survey respondents were asked to pair these. I'm going to just skip through this quickly. There were 2 models that were developed. One simply used demographic and operation characteristics as explanatory variables for the centrality of grazing management. The second one added in the adaptive management index. So we got 80 different indicators. 16 of those needed to be excluded because the kappa values were less than 0.6, and leaving 64 indicators, 20 for planning, 25 for monitoring, 8 for evaluation, and 11 for adjustment. The results, application of evaluation processes explain most of the variance in the adaptive management index, aside from the rotational grazing indicators. However, importantly, the evaluation phase had the lowest average value. In other words, landowner or respondents were indicating that this was least like them compared to indicators related to planning, monitoring, and adaptation itself. So the indication here is that strengthening capacity of producers to interpret monitored data and assess outcomes may enhance adaptive management capacity, because that seems to be the bottleneck for people being able to apply adaptive management. In terms of the two regression models, what's important here, there's a lot of numbers on here, you don't need to be able to read it all, but importantly, and I've highlighted that, is that the adaptive management index, when it was added into model 2, was highly significant for every one of the 5 different elements of grazing management dynamics. And importantly, also increased the R-squared value in 4, statistically significantly in 4 of those different elements. Real quick, the conclusions. Current strategies for operationalizing adaptive management in grazing systems does not adequately account for the 5 phases of adaptive management, whereas the adaptive management index was positively correlated with perceptions of increased connectedness between elements of grazing systems that are critical to the system dynamics, which suggests that perceptions of grazing system dynamics change as the degree of implementation of adaptive management increases, which supported our hypothesis. And the bottom last comment is that the application of the adaptive management index in future research may provide more consistent approach to defining and measuring the use of adaptive management in grazing systems. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
No time.
No, we are.
Do not want to keep people from tea.
Well, we're going to have to semi-keep them from tea anyway, so just so you know. Our next speaker is Londiwe Mokoena from the University of Pretoria. And she's talking about rewilding and its potential to enhance ecosystem services. No? Yeah. Right. You tell them. Please use the mic. You get 20 minutes, 12 minutes counted.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Londiwe Mokoena, and I'm very excited to be here today to share some preliminary results from my PhD chapter. I am focusing on looking at the role of large herbivores in suppressing and dispersing invasive alien plants in South African savannas. Yeah, that is. I think I'm short. Megaherbivores are herbivorous animals that tend to weigh over 1,000 kilograms. And the most notable examples of these are elephants, rhinos, hippos, and giraffes. And because of their enormous size, they play a role in the environment that no other species can. They tend to be considered as ecosystem engineers, meaning that they physically alter their habitats in such a way that they shape and structure entire ecosystems. They do this by uprooting plants, leaves, barks, and opening up vegetation and creating open spaces that allow species such as grasses and forbs to succeed, and they depend on these spaces. Megaherbivores also contribute to nutrient cycling through their dung and urine. They disperse seeds over long distances. They connect different parts of landscapes. They're also key players in influencing fire regimes. And lastly, they also tend to, when these animals disappear in ecosystems, they can change, when these large herbivores disappear, they can change ecosystems dramatically. And we often see bush encroachment, reduced biodiversity, and loss of ecosystem resilience in these places. So across the globe, megaherbivores are declining due to poaching, land use, and habitat fragmentations. And at the same time, invasive species are spreading, especially in ecosystems that have already been disturbed by human activity. And when these pressures combine, they result in what we call novel ecosystems. And in these places, native plants tend to struggle while invasive plants thrive, largely due to the absence of their natural enemies. Invasive plants originate from other regions, but have established themselves, spreading aggressively and causing harm to local ecosystems. They often outcompete native plants for resources such as light, water, and nutrients, and tend to shift plant communities and cause broader ecosystem changes. Human activities significantly speed up the invasion process by moving these plants around and making the conditions more favorable for them to establish. And once they've established, they tend to change key ecosystem processes, such as changing the water quality, using up more water as compared to native plants, and changing as well as soil properties. These changes often reduce native plant biodiversity, displacing native plants and modifying habitats in such a way that is impossible to reverse sometimes. Despite their ecological importance, we still know very little about the role of large herbivores and invasive plants. Most of existing research focuses on them grazing on native plants. But what do we actually know about their potential to regulate invasive species by simply doing what they normally do, which is feed, move, and disturb ecosystems? Could these animals actually be helping regulate and suppress invasive species through just feeding and disturbance? That's what I aim to try to accomplish with my PhD. So I wanted to look at whether megaherbivores reduce the abundance of alien plants and they potentially suppress their recruitment or accelerate their spread. So we do this by looking at whether megaherbivores cause physical damage or browsing pressure on young adults and adult plants, and whether they actually affect the recruitment of seedlings and saplings. So I looked at multiple reserves in two areas, which were KZN, Pretoria, and the Waterberg. And we paired sites between site reserves that had megaherbivore presence and those that excluded megaherbivores. We tried to keep as much the sites to be the same in terms of vegetation and invasive species in each site. I looked at herbivory or browsing pressure, trampling damage, as well as recruitment of seedlings. In each site, I selected 20 individuals of invasive species. This is including number listed and unlisted. So whatever invasive species was in a reserve is what we measured. We assessed browsing pressure from a score between 0 to 100, as well as trampling damage in each reserve. And then in terms of seedling recruitment, I created 3 5x5 plots where we counted the number of seedlings that we find in each plot. There'd be a parent plant or an adult plant in each plot just to see if there's dispersal there or movement of seedlings. And in terms of the data, most of my data was very much zero inflated and proportioned. So I used hurdle models as well as a mixture of GLM mixed effects model looking at the reserves, species, and treatment as well. And in terms of my results, from the models, we realized that there was browsing, in fact, on the seedlings as well as on the adult species. So I pulled out the 10 most browsed for both seedlings as well as adult plants. And we see that mostly from the first one, which is Sirius Jamakaru. I think that's Queen of the Night. I don't think I know. It's Queen of the Night, Opuncha. And so for both the adults as well as the seedlings, it's mostly the succulent plants. Then I looked at the effect of the presence of megaherbivores as well on the browsing of these invasive species. So there was a significant difference in both seedlings as well as adult plants, meaning that these pressures is actually affecting not just the adults, but also the survival of the species themselves. And we can look at it as well in the lens of the enemy escape hypothesis, meaning that invasive species tend to survive when they don't have their natural enemies affecting them, especially in their most vulnerable stage when they're still young. And then in terms of when I ran my model, species was also in effect. So I wanted to see that in this megavore present or absent site, were there differences between the most browsed species themselves. And I found that there was differences between species themselves. Some species were browsed definitely more than others, such as Queen of the Night, again, which has been coming up a lot more when looking. And then I looked at the effect of trampling. So most of the species, again, there's variation between species on which species were being trampled and were being affected by these large herbivores. However, surprisingly, there wasn't an effect of trampling in terms of the presence or absence of large herbivores. It could be because I had a variation of different herbivore assemblages in terms of the reserve. So some reserves had elephants and larger animals as compared to others. So that could be an effect or something to consider when modeling, just to see is there an effect between like the gradient or going down herbivore assemblages. And then I also looked at the species themselves, if they were affected by the presence or absence of large herbivores. And again, it's still the same species, which is your queen of the night and Opuntia species. And lastly, in terms of the recruitment, seedlings were definitely being recruited. We have specific species that are also coming up, your cat creeper, your solanum species. But again, surprisingly, the effect of large herbivores did not have an influence on recruitment. I had expected that in sites that had herbivores, there'd be lesser recruitment because of their presence. But again, it could be linked with the lack of disturbance itself, or the herbivores could be opening up spaces, allowing for recruitment to actually be happening. And then in terms of the species themselves, there wasn't much difference between mega herbivore present or absence. Actually, no, there was. But again, it was just more recruitment in areas with larger herbivores as compared to areas with no herbivores. And I had expected the opposite. So what I found out here is that mega herbivores affect alien plants in two ways, through consumption and disturbance. From consumption, it could be eating from the fruits to the leaves to the seeds, as well as in disturbing, that's uprooting the plants themselves. But these effects could either suppress or control. So it's not a one-sided conversation whereby if we put in these herbivores in these systems, they will definitely suppress or it could be one or the other. Picture an elephant walking through a field of pom-pom. Just because of their structure and their functional traits, they could disperse that species a lot more. But when you have Opuntia, if they're feeding on it, and again, depending on the functional traits of depending on the functional traits of that invasive species, they could be controlled. So their seeds are not spreading. By the time they release or they defecate, the seeds are already dead and there's nothing that could be spread. And in terms of dispersal of disturbance, these species could be damaged or broken down before flowering. So it all depends on timing, functional traits on both the invasive end as well as the mega herbivores. An interesting scenario here was, one of my first chapter is looking at the diet of these mega herbivores. So we've been collecting dung samples. So as I've been collecting dung of large herbivores, I've seen a trend between the Datura ferox and black rhino. So whenever in these middens, we would find seedlings inside the dung or just around the dung, as well as evidence of trampled larger plants of these Datura. So there's a clear relationship between these herbivores and Datura. So they're either spreading it or they're controlling it. But what I do want to highlight and make an important note, there's a lot of publications and work being done about bringing in large herbivores to try and control invasive species. It is not a miracle solution. There's certain areas whereby invasive species have spread so much that bringing as many herbivores will not do anything to that area. And an example of this is one of my sites in KZN in Itshala. Everything here that's green is actually Lantana camara. And all the other species are just dead, large native plants. There is no amount of herbivores that we can bring into the system that will fix this. So this is a good solution. It can work out, but it has to be done in the early stages when an ecosystem can still be resilient. And we have to also look at other factors such as functional traits and compatibility between herbivores and the species themselves. A lot more work can be done into this, but at certain points, it's not a miracle, quick fix. Here you go, put in herbivores and then we fix it. So in conclusion, mega herbivores can reduce alien plants. The impacts can be seen in both adults as well as the seedlings, and there's potential to restore ecological balances, but in some cases. I'd like to thank my supervisors, collaborators, and funders, and a lot of my field assistants, as well as the reserve managers that allowed for this research to be done. Thank you.
I'm fantastic with time, so I'm going to allow one quick question while our next speaker comes to the front. There, Mike.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. For the sake of time, I'll ask one question. If I heard you correct, you said most of the species that were consumed were succulent species, am I right? Am I right?
No, I did say, I said the top, mostly browsed. It's not
Mostly
really-
browsed.
Mostly browsed. So
Okay.
a lot of the other species were also browsed on, but the ones that had a lot more browsing pressure most of the species were browsed, but the ones that had a lot more browsing pressure exerted on them were succulents. So
Okay, if I'm trying to connect the survival of the seed from the dung with the seed coat level, if the case was, for example, the consumed species were Vachelia species, either Alotica or whatever, do you think would be the survival of the seed from the dung would be the same as compared to the succulent seed?
I actually had the same idea. So I'm going to find out next year, January. I'm going to collect dung and see what species actually survive in the dung, because eating and ingesting doesn't necessarily mean you'll spread or those seeds will survive. So, but to speculate, I think it depends on the functional traits of the species. So some seeds have coating, they have covers, they're actually designed to specifically germinate through passing through the stomach of certain herbivores. So it's very much species dependent again. Yes, I hope I've answered.
Fantastic. Thank you, Londiwe. We've got 3 5-minute talks between us and tea, and I'd like to invite Tanki Thubela, who's coming from the far back, to talk about his work on looking at allelopathy in the encroaching Pteronia incana. And this is the point, and this is to advance it by
Okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Tanki. I'll be talking about the chemical characterization and the allelopathic effects of the Pteronia incana on the native species occurring in the Eastern Cape in the area of Pedi. Okay, these are the partners that I'll be working with, as I'm not a specialist in chemistry, so I had to rope in some people from chemistry to actually assist. Okay, that is my introduction. In fact, the table of contents. And then in terms of the introduction, Pteronia incana is regarded as one of the species that is actually affecting about 60,000 hectares across the country and also in Namibia. It also been distributed, in fact, it's already also distributed in Namibia and South Africa. It's native, it's not an invasive alien, and then it threatens the biodiversity in terms of the species and also affects the habitat structure and the land degradation, also resulting in the effects of livelihood, because most of the people in these areas are dependent on these rangelands for grazing. This is the picture of the Pteronia incana. According to Dariam, she says that in her classification of the maps of South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland, that some of the areas that were regarded as thicket under the Albany thicket are actually realized to be not in the Albany thicket. Then they are reclassifying at the moment, meaning that this species is actually moving out of its boundary of the habitat. The other effect is that the species doesn't allow almost all the species to grow underneath. It can be maybe because of the canopy cover, or maybe it can be because of the allelopathy effect that we are actually looking at as a defensive mechanism. The main objective of the study will be actually to characterize the chemical compounds and evaluate the allelopathic effects of them on certain species that are neighboring this plant. Okay, the study will be basically more on the laboratory, and also will also test some of these compounds in the glass house to look at the germination and the growth of the native species. Okay, we'll collect the Pteronia incana from the field, and then we'll oven dry it, and then after that we'll ground it, and then do some solvent extraction using about 3 at least of the solvent extraction, including water and ethanol and methanol. And then after that, we will test on the Petri dish to actually look at what is it, what are the species, the seeds that can grow and the ones that cannot grow. And then thereafter, we will actually take it back to actually fractionate again and look if maybe when we test again, the compounds that are mostly being inhibitory are the ones that we are going to actually take as the one that we are going to test the seeds against. And then we are actually going to also validate that and do the compound characterization at the end, where we'll be using mass spectrometry. Then thereafter, the data will be analyzed using the GLMs, and then we are hoping that the results will show that there is actually allelopathy, because we've looked at the allelochemicals compounds that can be there on the plant, looking at the flavonoids and other compounds that are there. I'm looking forward to hear more about the inputs on this. Thank you very much.
Very much, Tanki. Please catch him over tea and in the course of the Congress to give feedback and ask questions. Our next speaker is Sindiso Chamane, who is going to talk about the influence of woody plant encroachment on understory vegetation. The floor is yours. Please do keep an eye on time.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Sindiso Chamane. I'll be presenting my master's paper, supervised by Mthunzi Mndela, on the influence of woody plant encroachment on understory vegetation. Depends on the functional traits of an encroacher. Insights from global meta-analysis. Firstly, rangelands are vast, open grassland. Sorry. Rangelands are vast, open landscape, such as savannas and woody plants. They sustain livelihoods of millions of people. Global rangelands collectively cover up to 30% of the Earth's surface. Over the past centuries, rangelands has been jeopardized by woody plant encroachment. This woody plant encroachment reduces grassland. The severity of woody plant encroachment effect depends on the functional traits of an encroacher. We see an insight on this meta-analysis to answer the two questions. Does the influence of woody plant encroachment on herbaceous vegetation depend on the understory plant life form? Do the response of understory vegetation to woody plant depend on the functional traits of an encroacher? Our methods. A detailed assessment of the scientific literature was done to identify and download studies relative to woody plant encroachment. The target studies were published over the past 4 decades. Different search methods were different search engines were used to search different relevant studies using the keywords. In each study, we recorded statistical measurements such as mean, standard deviation, sample size, country references. These statistical measurements were extracted directly from tables and graphs. We feature random effects models to generate the hedges standardized mean difference as the effect size between two independent groups. Our results. We found that wood plant encroachment had a significant negative effect on grass cover, more so when the encroacher is deciduous. Wood plant encroachment had no significant effect on forb cover. Wood plant encroachment reduced significantly both grass and forb species richness, more so when the encroacher was leguminous. Wood plant encroachment had a differential effects on grass density and forb cover. Leguminous encroachers and leguminous encroachers and tree encroachers reduced grass density severely. The opposite was true for forb density. Conclusion. Overall, grasses and forbs responded differently to wood plant encroachment, depending largely on nitrogen fixation status and stature of encroacher. Herbaceous plant vegetation employed differential mechanism and strategies to cope with wood plant encroachment. So, wood plant encroachment should be planned according to the stature of an encroacher. If grass recovery is a target for the goal of restoration. Thank you.
And you see, it's not just the rock stars who get the disco lights. All right, our very last 5-minute speaker this morning is Ntongayesizwe Hau, and she's going to be talking to us about the effect of season on nutrient contents of cercia species. And I'm sorry about the pronoun. Floor is yours.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Ongewa from the Northwest University. I'll be presenting the effect of season on macro and micromineral contents of cercia species harvested in the Northwest Province for ruminant production. Ruminants in the Northwest Province often rely on natural vegetation to meet their nutritional demands. Cercia species are critical for feeding during dry season when grasses are scarce, offering food protein, minerals, and bioactive compounds. Minerals contribute to growth, enzyme activity, and immune function in ruminants, therefore influencing the overall health and reproductive performance. Minerals fluctuate within and among plants due to factors such as season and soil type. Dry season pastures lack key nutrients, limiting livestock production in communal rangelands. Therefore, this study assessed the effects of season on mineral concentration of cercia species harvested in the Northwest Province. The study was conducted at the Northwest University, where we harvested Cercia lancea, Cercia phyroids in 4 seasons, which were summer, spring, autumn, and winter. After the sample collection, the samples were dried at room temperature for about 2 weeks prior grounding. All the samples were then milled to pass through 1 milliliter sieve and stored in labeled samples pending the analysis. The mineral content was determined following the guidelines provided by ADRLASA. Then the leaves were analyzed for potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, sulfur, calcium, iron, copper, manganese, zinc, and boron. All the data was subjected to two-way analysis of variance. So these are the results. As you can see, the phosphorus, potassium, calcium were affected by season, by the species, and by the interaction of season and the species. Here looking at magnesium, sodium, and sulfur. Magnesium was affected by the season, species, as well as interaction. Here we're looking at copper, iron, and zinc. Iron was affected by the season, by the species, as well as the season effect. And so moving to the discussion. In this study, the highest content of many minerals was mostly produced in winter, and this could be ascribed to low rainfall or drought stress. Plants under low rainfall or drought stress accumulate more minerals from the soil to alleviate drought stress for supporting plant survival and growth. The phosphorus content was below the recommended range of 1.6 to 3.8 grams per kg for adult goats requirements. Despite seasonal variation, both species had substantial amount of calcium, which met the requirements for adult goats, sheep, and beef cattle. Sulfur content was below the recommended range for goats to meet the minimum requirement. Goats feeding on these species will be challenged by hydropremia if no leaks are provided to them. The iron content met the minimum requirements required by goats. Iron is required for transportation of oxygen through the blood and storing oxygen in animal tissues. So in conclusion, in all the seasons, both species has a suitable amount of potassium, calcium, magnesium, copper, and manganese required for maintenance. However, the phosphorus, sodium, zinc did not meet the minimum requirements, and this may limit livestock productivity. Therefore, there is a need to provide mineral blocks or supplements